Hi, my name's Jeanette. I'm with Kimberbell Designs. Today we are going to stitch a center block from Cuties Volume 2, July through December. We're stitching the squares block that coordinates with the July design. So I have all of my materials prepped and ready to go. I have my hoop, my 5x7 hoop with light mesh cutaway stabilizer. I have all of my fabric cut, and I have ironed on fusible backing. Let me show you this one, fusible backing to the back of all of my fabrics. And we are using block by block quilting. So I have my batting, my project batting ready to go as well. The first thing we are going to do is load both files into the machine. I have with me my Cuties book and the PDF. I have it loaded on my iPad so that I can see the instructions from the quilting bundle that I purchased. So we are ready to go. So the first thing we're going to do is load both the quilting file and the embroidery file into the machine at the same time. So we're stacking them together. On the bottom, I'm putting the quilting file, and then on top, I'm putting the applique file. And we are going to line them up. And in my book, there are alignment instructions that tell me that both of the files are going to be centered. So when they say centered, automatically those files will come up centered, so I don't have to move anything for this design. So we just get to load both of them. Before we load the files in the embroidery machine, let's talk about the different quilting files that come with the bundle. There is a 5x7 file in the quilting and a 6x10. They quilt the exact same quilting. Your block at the end will look exactly the same. The difference is that there are less tack down lines along the side. This block cut size is at 5.5 by 5.5 inches, and that doesn't fit in a 5x7 hoop. And so we remove some of those tack down lines so that it would fit in a 5x7 hoop. So if you have a hoop larger than 5x7, I would recommend just loading that 6x10 quilting file. If you only have a 5x7 hoop, then you need to use the 5x7 quilting file, but the result at the end will be the same. Additionally, this is done a little different than our regular block by block quilting. Usually we place the background fabric and quilt all over the background fabric and then proceed with the applique portion of the block. For the Cuties center blocks, we wanted to mimic the look of a pieced block with quilting on top. So instead of quilting the background fabric, we're actually going to wait to do the quilting. We're going to wait to do the quilting until the very end. So we're going to load the quilting file and stitch the batting lines. Then we're going to skip to the applique file and stitch all of the applique parts, and then go back to the quilting file to stitch the quilting. So let's go ahead and go to the machine and we'll load both of those files. I have all of the quilting files pulled up, and I'm going to choose the 5x7 quilting design for the centers. So this design is cute ants. I'm going to set that. I'm going to add, and every machine type is different, so you'll need to make sure you look in your machine manufacturer. I'm adding the squares embroidery file on top of that. So you can see I have both files loaded into the machine, and I'm ready to go to embroidery. So then I'm taking my hoop and I'm going to go ahead and stitch the placement line for the batting. Okay. So we have stitched the batting placement line. So we're going to place our batting completely covering the line. Just want to make sure that covers it. We're going to use some Kimberbell paper tape to hold that batting in place. And then we're going to stitch the batting tack down line. Okay, we have stitched the batting tack down line. We're going to trim around the batting. So I'm just going to remove the paper tape. and then trim around the batting. We are going to go ahead and stitch the background fabric placement line. So we've just stitched the background placement line, and this is the 5x7 file, so it has only stitched a placement line on the bottom and the top. If you are using the 6x10 file, it will have stitched a complete box around the entire thing. So I'm just going to go ahead and place my background fabric, just covering the line and using some tape to help secure it in place. And then we're going to stitch the background tack down line. All right, we have just stitched the tack down line for the background fabric, and you can see it's a really long basting stitch. So at the end, these two sides, this is right on our finished seam line. So we're going to be removing these at the end before we trim this and put it in our quilt. So the next thing that we need to do is go ahead and skip the quilting step on our embroidery machine so that we're jumping into the applique file, and we'll be stitching the first placement line on our applique design. So every machine will be just a little bit different. This one, I am just skipping one machine step. So you can see the quilting is here, and I'm just skipping past it to my first placement line, and I'm ready to go. Let me put my hoop on the machine, and we are stitching our very first placement line. And this is for our square one placement line. So I've stitched the placement line for the first piece of applique, which is the square one fabric. And you can see I've switched my thread to red thread. So I'm going to take my square one piece of fabric, and I'm going to just place it completely covering that placement line, and go ahead and tape it. And tape that in place. We're going to take it to the machine, and we're going to stitch the tack down line for square one. So we have just stitched the tack down line for square one, and you can see it's only stitched two of the sides of the triangle and not this third side. So the reason that this third side did not stitch is that this side of the triangle is going into the seam allowance, and so we didn't want to have you to unpick anything. We've left that longer, and we're only going to trim around the two sides that were stitched. So I'm just trimming close to the stitch line. And then this gets decorative stitching on it. So when we have decorative stitching, we like to put that right next to your tack down line so that you don't have to change your thread again each time. So we're going to go ahead and take it back to the machine, and we're going to stitch the decorative stitch for square one. Okay, so I did the decorative stitch for square one, and you can see it only did one of the two sides we tacked down. That's because when we place this other piece of fabric, it's going to do the decorative stitch on both sides. We had two pieces of fabric that could be different colors, and so we decided to have this tack down line go with your second piece of fabric. So it just did that one side. So next we're going to take it back to the machine, and we're going to stitch the placement line for square two. So this has stitched the square two placement line, taking the square two fabric, and I'm going to place it completely covering that line and tape that in place. Next, we're going to stitch the tack down line for square two. We've stitched the square 2 tack down line, and you can see again that it only stitched 2 sides of the triangle and not the 3rd side, because this goes into the seam allowance and we didn't want to stitch a basting stitch or a stitch that would be seen in your final product. So we've just left it so that that fabric will just hang off into the seam allowance, and we'll trim that when we trim the block. So I'm going to go ahead and remove my paper tape and trim around the 2 edges of square 2 that were sewn. Now we're ready to stitch the decorative stitch for square 2. I'm just going to stitch both of those edges. We've just stitched the decorative outline for square 2, and it is stitched both of these edges with a nice decorative finish. We're ready to stitch the placement line for square 3. So we've just stitched the placement line for square 3. We're going to place that fabric, completely covering the placement line. I'm going to use paper tape to tape that in place. We're going to go ahead and stitch the square 3 tack down line. Okay, we have stitched the square 3 tack down line. We're going to trim the fabric. So this applique piece actually has an external cut around the entire square and an internal cut. We're going to be cutting out this portion inside of the square. I'm going to remove my paper tape, and I'm going to cut around the outside of the square, and then I will cut the internal cut on the inside of the square. And again, I like to just move my hoop so that it's easier for me to hold and cut the fabric. So I'm ready to do the internal cut inside of the square, and there's a couple ways you can go about doing that. You can just go ahead and pierce your fabric with your snips. Another option that you can also use is piercing it with a seam ripper, which is a really easy option. So you can just drag it in here, and you can see I'm like lifting the fabric up. So I know I'm not cutting into the below fabric. I just cut a small hole in that fabric, just like that. And then it's easy for me to get my scissors inside to cut towards an edge. And then I'm cutting on that inside edge all the way around. That is all trimmed up, and I'm ready to go ahead and stitch the decorative outline for square 3. Okay, we have stitched the decorative outline for square 3. And you want to be really excited to do your quilting, but you need to make sure that you complete all of the instructions for the block in the book. So machine step 10 in the book has a special icon in front of it. Instead of a filled in color block, there is an eye, and that means you need to use a visible thread for this part. This next step is going to help you be able to trim your block to the correct size. So it's really important that you do this step before you finish your block. So we're going to change to a visible thread color and then stitch the trimming guideline and tick marks. I've stitched the trimming lines. You can see with the center tick mark, those are going to help us in the end to be able to trim our block to the correct size. So now that we've finished all of the applique portion of the block, we're going to skip back into the quilting file and stitch the quilting on top of all of this. Okay, so since I finished all of the applique block, it's taken me to the beginning of my embroidery file again. So I'm going to skip machine steps until I see that I'm going to do the quilting. And here's the quilting. So I'm ready to hit go and do the quilting on top of my finished applique block. I'm finished in the hoop, right? Got the embroidery file all done, check. The quilting is done. And most important, I have my trimming guides all stitched, so we're ready to take this out of the hoop. We are going to be using the trimming instructions found on page 25 in your book to stitch this. So you can see the center tick mark is going to help us a lot because in a 5x7 hoop, we don't have any lines at all to go by. So our finished trim size is going to be 5.5 by 5.5 inches. So to measure that, we can go ahead and align our ruler and cut both of these. I really like to measure the whole thing first. So we're measuring, if we're cutting at 5.5 inches, half of that, and it says that right in your book, is 2 3/4 inch. So from this tick mark, we're going to measure out 2 3/4 inch, and we're going to draw a line with our water soluble pen. So 2 3/4 inches. So 1, 2 3/4 puts me right here at this line, and I want to make sure that the same line is on the tick mark in both places. I can even use a line on the ruler that's going this way to make sure that I'm not tilted with the ruler. So again, the same 2 3/4 inches and 2 3/4 inches. And now I'm just going to use my marker and just draw a line, and then I'm going to repeat that on the other side, and I'm just going to flip my block around. So then I'm repeating the same motion. That just makes it easier for me. So 1, 2 3/4 inches on both lines, and I've lined up that line, so I'm drawing this line. So then here's my block, and I can actually measure it and make sure that this is going to trim. That's 5.5 inches right there on my 5.5 inch mark on my ruler, and it's 5.5 inches this way. Also, another way that you can trim it, now I'm just ready to use my rotary cutter and trim around every block on the marked sides. We also found very helpful while we were making this in product development is using a 5.5 inch ruler. Just getting a 5.5 inch by 5.5 inch ruler and then centering that 2 3/4 center line right on the line and making sure that top and bottom were directly on those trimming guides. And then it would be really easy to use a rotating cutting mat and just cutting each side and rotating it as you go. So this ruler is super handy to have too. You don't have to have it. You can use just a regular ruler and a rotary cutter. So I'm going to go ahead and trim top and bottom right along those marks. Just following the instructions just like it said. Trim off the top. There's the bottom. Again, just trimming right on my marked lines. I'm making sure it's nice and square, that this line is on my cut edge. Trimming right on that line. And again, this last cut, I can even just make sure again that that line is right on that 5.5 inch line, so that this is 5.5 inches and it's square because I've got all my lines lined up. Here is my squares block, and I need to make 4 of these to complete a cutie. The only thing left I have to do is just unpick my center tick marks, and this one side right here had the basting stitches. Those will be seen if I don't unpick those. This side, they were covered up with applique pieces. So I just need to unpick those, and then my square block is ready to go. I just need to make 3 more. So we finished our square block. We need to make 3 more blocks to finish out all of our centers. So look for our next video showing you how to make the triangle for the July, the picnic and the park block.